Did you kiss me? Jimin's voice cut through the studio, quiet but sharp enough to make every conversation disappear. Suga stood only inches away, his expression unreadable beneath the bright television lights. Fallon stopped mid-sentence. The musicians lowered their hands. Even the audience seemed afraid to breathe. For one impossible second, Jimin stared at Suga as if searching for an answer that could explain what had just happened. Suga finally whispered, "Because you needed to know you weren't alone." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. But what happened moments later would reveal that the kiss was never really about Jimin or Suga at all. So tell me, if you were sitting in that studio, would you judge Suga for crossing a line, or would you wait to discover the heartbreaking secret behind his decision?
The studio lights slowly returned to their normal warmth, but the silence left behind by those few seconds did not disappear. Fallon glanced toward the cameras, then toward Jimin and Suga, searching for the right expression to wear when something unscripted happens in front of thousands of people. Jimin lowered his eyes, one hand still gripping the edge of his jacket, while Suga stood beside him with an unusual stillness. To everyone watching at home, it might have looked like an impulsive joke that had gone too far. But this was a fictional story, and beneath that public moment was a much quieter story that had begun several hours earlier. It was a cold evening in New York, and the sidewalks outside the studio were glowing beneath a thin layer of rain. Black cars moved slowly through the wet streets, their headlights stretching across the pavement like pale ribbons. Inside the building, however, everything moved at twice the speed. Crew members hurried between corridors carrying headsets, clipboards, cables, microphones, and cups of coffee that had already gone cold. A producer counted down rehearsal times. A makeup artist adjusted a light near the dressing room mirror. Someone from security quietly reminded the staff that the hallway needed to remain clear. And in one corner of the backstage area, Jimin sat beside a small table, staring at a folded piece of paper. He had received it less than an hour before the show. It was not a letter from a fan in the usual sense. There was no elaborate decoration, no photograph, no collection of gifts, just several lines written in uneven handwriting and a name at the bottom, Alina. Jimin had read the note 3 times. "I don't need you to fix my life," it said. "I just wanted one person to know that I tried." He folded the paper carefully as though the thin sheet might tear beneath his fingers. Across the room, Suga noticed him. "You've been reading that for 10 minutes, he said quietly. Jimin looked up. "Have I? Maybe 11. A faint smile appeared between them, but it disappeared almost immediately. Suga walked over and sat beside him. He did not ask to see the note, he simply looked at Jimin's face. "Bad news?" Jimin shook his head. "Not exactly." "Good news?" Another pause. "Not exactly that either." Suga leaned back, listening to the muffled sound of the audience gathering beyond the walls. "Then what is it?" Jimin looked toward the closed door. "Someone came here hoping we'd remember her." Suga's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for Jimin to notice. "And I think she was afraid nobody would." For a moment neither spoke. The distant applause grew louder as the studio prepared for the live segment. Suga looked down at his hands. "Who is she?" Jimin hesitated. "I'll tell you after the show." Suga turned toward him. "Why after?" Jimin finally met his eyes. "Because if I tell you now you'll do something." Suga gave a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. "That's a strange accusation. You know it's true." "Maybe," he looked at the folded paper, "but maybe that's not always a bad thing." A stage manager appeared at the doorway. 5 minutes. Jimin nodded. Suga stood, straightening his jacket, then he stopped. "Whatever this is," he said, "don't carry it alone." Jimin watched him leave, his fingers tightening around the note. 5 minutes later, the stage lights came alive. The audience erupted when BTS entered. RM waved toward the crowd, Jungkook grinned at the front rows, J-Hope moved with his usual bright energy, Jin exchanged a playful look with the camera, and V smiled as the applause rolled through the room. Jimin and Suga walked beside each other, apparently calm. Nobody in the audience knew that one of them was carrying a handwritten plea in his pocket. Nobody knew that the other had already decided he would not let the story end backstage. And nobody could have predicted that, before the night was over, a carefully controlled television appearance would become the place where 2 private promises collided with one very public moment. Hidden conflict. The name Alina belonged to a 23-year-old violinist who had spent most of her life believing that talent could compensate for everything else she had lost. She had grown up in a small apartment in Queens with her mother, who worked double shifts at a bakery, and a younger brother named Matteo, whose asthma had made hospital corridors more familiar to the family than they ever wanted them to be. Alina had started playing violin at 8 after finding an old instrument in a community center where her mother cleaned at night. The violin was scratched, slightly warped, and missing a piece near the chin rest. It was not valuable. To Alina, it was priceless. For years, she practiced whenever she could, sometimes beneath the weak yellow light of their kitchen after midnight while Matteo slept in the next room. She dreamed of performing on a real stage one day, not because she wanted fame, but because she wanted her mother to sit in an audience and see that all those exhausted nights had meant something. Then 6 months before the night of the television appearance, Alina's right hand began to tremble. At first, she ignored it. Then the tremor became stronger. A doctor told her she needed further tests. The tests led to more appointments, more uncertainty, and eventually a diagnosis that forced her to confront the possibility that the future she had imagined might not arrive in the form she expected. She stopped performing. She stopped answering messages from the small orchestra that had given her a place. Even her violin remained inside its case for weeks. Her mother kept telling her that losing one dream did not mean losing her entire life, but Alina could not hear it. She felt as though every encouraging sentence was another way of saying, "You don't understand." Then one afternoon, while sitting in a hospital waiting room with Matteo asleep against her shoulder, Alina saw a short interview with Jimin and Suga on a television mounted high above the reception desk. The interview was not profound. They were laughing about music, exhaustion, friendship, and the strange pressure of being watched while trying to remain ordinary people. But one sentence stayed with her. Jimin had said that sometimes people believed they had to be strong because everyone expected them to be, when in reality asking someone to stay beside you could be its own form of courage. Alina replayed the clip that night. Then she wrote the letter. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for a photograph. She did not even ask to meet them. She simply wrote about the violin, her mother, Matteo, the diagnosis, and the shame she felt because she could no longer recognize herself. At the end, she wrote, "I don't need you to fix my life. I just wanted one person to know that I tried." Somehow the letter reached the production team, someone read it, someone passed it along. And eventually it reached Jimin. But Alina had never intended to be part of the show. She had been invited backstage because a producer thought her story might become a small human interest moment. She declined at first, then her mother convinced her to go. "You don't have to perform," her mother told her while helping her button her coat that evening. "Just let them see you." Alina had almost turned around twice before entering the building. She carried the violin case with her, though she had not opened it in nearly a month. She sat alone in a quiet backstage room while the television monitor showed the live program. When BTS appeared on stage, she smiled despite herself. For the first time in weeks, she looked less tired. But then the producer came in and told her something that made the smile disappear. "There's been a change," the producer said gently. "They'd like you to come out later." Alina immediately shook her head. "No. You don't have to play." "I said no," the producer stopped. "Okay." Alina looked down at the violin case. Her fingers trembled against the handle. "I came here because I wanted to say thank you," she whispered. "I didn't come here to become a story." The producer understood and quietly left. Minutes later, a staff member accidentally left the backstage monitor visible from the corridor. Suga happened to walk past and saw Alina sitting there. He recognized her immediately from the photograph attached to the letter. He stopped. He watched her for several seconds without entering. She was staring at the stage monitor, but she wasn't watching the performance anymore. She was looking at her own reflection in the darkened glass. Suga understood something then. Alina was not afraid of the audience. She was afraid of being seen only as someone broken. He walked back toward the dressing area and found Jimin. "She's here," he said. Jimin looked up. "Alina," Suga nodded, "and she doesn't want to go on stage." Jimin stood immediately. "Then she doesn't have to." Suga looked at him. "I know," there was a pause, "but I think she needs something." Jimin's expression softened. "What?" Suga glanced toward the stage where the audience was still laughing at Jimmy's jokes. "Not a spotlight," he lowered his voice. "Someone who will sit beside her when the spotlight turns off." Neither of them knew yet how difficult that promise would become. And neither realized that, before the night ended, Alina's trembling hand would force all of them to decide what kindness really meant when cameras were watching. Escalation. The countdown clock above the stage continued to move, but backstage time seemed to fracture into smaller, heavier pieces. Every few seconds another door opened, another crew member crossed the corridor, another burst of applause traveled through the walls like distant thunder. Jimin stood near the monitor with his arms folded, watching Alina from across the backstage room. She still had not opened the violin case. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her coat remained buttoned despite the warmth inside the building, and one hand rested protectively over the other as if she were trying to stop the trembling before anyone could notice. Suga stood beside Jimin without saying anything. On the monitor, Fallon was laughing with the audience, completely unaware of the quiet storm unfolding behind the stage. "We have 3 minutes," a producer whispered into a headset. 3 minutes until the next segment." Jimin nodded, but his eyes remained on Alina. "She's scared," he said. "Yes, not of performing." Suga looked at him. "You noticed that too?" Jimin gave a small nod. "She's afraid people will look at her differently after they know." Suga's jaw tightened slightly. He understood that kind of fear. Not the same circumstances, not the same pain, but the strange exhaustion of having millions of eyes decide what your face meant before you had the chance to explain it yourself. "Then don't let them decide," he said. Jimin turned toward him. How? Suga did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the violin case. "Maybe we don't ask her to be brave." "Then what do we ask?" "Nothing." The answer surprised Jimin. Suga continued, "Maybe we just stay." Before Jimin could respond, Jungkook appeared around the corner holding 2 bottles of water. "You guys disappeared." He looked between them. "What's going on?" Jimin hesitated, then quietly explained that Alina was backstage and did not want to appear on camera. Jungkook's expression changed. He looked toward the closed door. "Does she need anything?" "Probably not," Jimin said. "That's the problem." Jungkook frowned. "What does that mean?" "Sometimes when people say they don't need anything, they mean they don't want to be a burden." Jungkook lowered his eyes. "Then maybe we should make sure she knows she isn't one." He placed one bottle of water on the table outside Alina's room and walked away without knocking. It was such a small gesture that nobody mentioned it again, but Alina noticed. She opened the door a few centimeters, saw the bottle, and stared at it for several seconds. There was no note, no camera, no request, just water. She picked it up. A few minutes later, RM came through the corridor. He had heard the story from the staff, but unlike the producer, he did not approach Alina with a plan. He simply asked Jimin, "Are you sure she wants us involved?" "No," Jimin answered honestly. "That's why we're being careful." RM nodded. "Good," he paused. "Then let her choose what happens next." Those words stayed with Jimin. Because somewhere between concern and good intentions, it was easy to turn another person's pain into something you wanted to solve. Alina did not need rescuing. She needed control over her own story. Meanwhile, the show continued. Jin and J-Hope were preparing for their next segment, laughing with the crew. V stood near the stage entrance, quietly watching the audience through the curtain. None of them knew exactly what would happen later, but they sensed that something unusual was happening backstage. J-Hope eventually walked toward Suga and asked, "Is everything okay?" Suga looked toward Jimin before answering, "Not really." J-Hope's smile softened. "Do you need me?" Suga shook his head. "Not yet." J-Hope nodded. "Then I'll stay close." It was the kind of answer that had become familiar among them over the years. No unnecessary questions, no dramatic promises, just presence. Then the producer approached Jimin with a new idea. "We can bring Alina out for 30 seconds, she said. "No performance, just a conversation. Jimmy can introduce her story. It could be beautiful." Jimin's face became serious. "She said no." "I know, but the segment has changed." "Then the segment needs to change again." The producer looked uncomfortable. "Jimin, we're live. There are thousands of people watching." "Exactly." His voice remained calm. "That's why her answer matters." The producer glanced at Suga, perhaps expecting him to soften the decision. He didn't. "She's not content," Suga said quietly. "She's a person." The producer exhaled and walked away, but the pressure did not disappear. A few minutes later, a staff member informed them that Jimmy had already been told there was a possible surprise guest. Jimin closed his eyes for a moment. "Who told him?" "The production team." Suga looked toward the stage. "Then we need to tell Jimmy the truth." They had barely taken 3 steps when Alina emerged from the room. Her face was pale. "I heard." Jimin stopped. "I'm sorry." Alina shook her head. "You didn't do it." Her voice was controlled, but her fingers were trembling again. "They want me to go on stage." "You don't have to," Jimin said. Alina looked at him. "But what if I do?" Jimin did not answer for her. "Then you choose it." She looked down. "What if I regret it?" "Then we'll deal with that too." Her eyes lifted slowly. "Why are you doing this?" Jimin's expression softened. "Because you came here asking to be heard, not displayed." Alina swallowed. "I don't know if I can walk onto that stage." Suga finally spoke. "Then don't walk alone." Alina looked at him. Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't inspirational. It wasn't polished. It sounded almost ordinary, and perhaps that was why it reached her. "Would you come with me?" she asked. Suga nodded once. "If you want me to." The stage manager appeared again. 1 minute, the audience erupted as Jimmy introduced the next portion of the show. Alina looked toward the stage entrance. Bright white lights spilled across the floor. She could hear thousands of people clapping. Her breathing became shallow. Jimin stepped closer but did not touch her. "Look at me," he said. Alina did. "You don't have to prove anything." She nodded, but tears had already begun forming in her eyes. Suga noticed the violin case beside her. "Bring it." Alina looked surprised. "Why?" "Because you carried it all the way here." He picked up the case and handed it to her. "Don't let tonight be the night you have to leave it behind." Alina held the handle. Her fingers trembled violently. Suga did not comment on it. Instead, he adjusted his sleeve and waited. The 3 of them stood there in silence while the applause grew louder. Then Alina whispered, "What if they see me shaking?" Jimin answered, "Then they see you shaking." She looked at him, almost confused. "That's it, that's it." He smiled faintly. "You don't have to hide every difficult thing to deserve a beautiful moment." For the first time that night, Alina smiled. It was small, uncertain, and real. They began walking toward the stage. Jimin followed on one side. Suga walked on the other, but just before they reached the entrance, Alina stopped. She stared through the curtain at the enormous studio, at Jimmy beneath the lights, at the cameras moving silently across the floor, at the audience waiting for something they did not yet understand. "I can't," she whispered. Suga immediately stopped. "Okay." No disappointment, no pressure, just one word, "Okay." Alina looked at him. "You really won't be angry?" "Why would I?" "Because everyone is waiting." Suga glanced toward the stage. "Let them wait." The sentence landed harder than any motivational speech could have. Alina lowered her head and breathed slowly. Then from somewhere beyond the curtain, Jimmy's voice carried through the studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have something very special coming up." Alina closed her eyes. "They've already started." Jimin stepped beside her. "Then we decide what happens next." But before they could turn around, the stage lights shifted. A camera operator moved into position. The audience began cheering because they could see Jimin and Suga standing near the entrance. Jimmy looked toward them, then toward the producer. Something unexpected was happening. Suga noticed the camera pointed directly at Alina. His expression hardened. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the lens and her. The camera immediately adjusted. Alina stared at his back. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. Suga did not turn around. "Because you said you weren't ready." And then Jimin understood something. The moment everyone thought was going to become television was actually becoming something else entirely. The producer was signaling frantically. The audience was growing louder. Jimmy was waiting. The camera kept moving closer. Suga looked at Jimin, and in that brief exchange there was an entire conversation neither of them needed to speak aloud. Protect her, stay with her, don't let this become a spectacle. Jimin nodded, then he stepped beside Suga. Two members of one of the world's most recognizable groups stood between a frightened young musician and a camera that wanted a story. But the story was already bigger than the camera. Alina suddenly reached for Suga's sleeve. Don't leave. He looked down at her hand. I won't. And that was the moment Jimin noticed the smallest detail of all. Alina wasn't trembling because she was afraid of the audience anymore. She was trembling because, for the first time in months, someone had actually believed her when she said she was afraid. The show had been built around surprise, laughter, music, and controlled spontaneity. Yet behind the curtain, three people were standing inside a silence that felt far more important than anything happening on stage. Then Jimmy's voice came again, this time softer because he had realized something was wrong. Jimin, Suga, everything okay back there? Suga looked toward the stage. Then toward Jimin, then toward Alina. He knew they had reached a decision that could not be undone. He stepped forward and Jimin followed. The curtain began to open. The audience erupted. Cameras turned toward them. Alina remained just behind the two men, clutching the violin case against her chest. And as the bright stage light fell across their faces, nobody in the room knew that the most shocking moment of the night had not happened yet. They thought they were about to witness a surprise television appearance. They did not know they were seconds away from seeing Suga make a completely unexpected gesture toward Jimin, one that would leave Jimmy Fallon speechless, the studio frozen, and millions of viewers wondering whether the moment had anything to do with romance at all, or whether it was a message meant for someone standing silently behind them.
The curtain opened fully, and for one suspended second the studio seemed to lose its rhythm. The stage lights were brighter than Alina expected. They washed over the polished floor, the instruments, the cameras, and the rows of faces staring toward the entrance. Jimmy Fallon stood near his desk with one hand still resting on a cue card. The band had stopped playing. Even the audience, which only moments earlier had been cheering, seemed to sense that something had changed. Jimin walked out first. Suga followed. Alina remained half a step behind them, holding the violin case against her chest like a shield. Jimmy looked at the three of them and then toward the producer standing just beyond the camera line. There was a question in his eyes. The producer gave the smallest nod. Jimmy turned back toward the audience. Well, he said slowly, this wasn't exactly how we planned this. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room. Jimin smiled politely, but his eyes remained on Alina. Neither was this, he said. Jimmy looked at him. Do you want to tell us what's happening? Jimin took a breath. Only if she wants to. The cameras shifted toward Alina. She immediately lowered her face. Suga noticed. He turned slightly toward the nearest camera and raised one hand. Not yet. It was a simple gesture, but the camera operator understood. The lens moved away. Jimmy's expression changed. He was no longer performing for the audience. He was listening. Okay, he said. No cameras on her. The audience became even quieter. Alina looked at Jimmy for the first time. There was no pressure in his face now, only patience. She looked toward Jimin. I can talk, she whispered. Are you sure? Jimin asked. Alina nodded, but I don't want them to tell my story for me. Then you tell it, she swallowed. I came here because I wanted to thank you. Jimin shook his head gently. You don't have to thank us. Alina looked down at the violin case. I do. Her voice cracked. She stopped, inhaled, and tried again. I haven't played in weeks. Nobody laughed, nobody moved, and I thought that meant I had failed. Somewhere in the audience, a person sniffed quietly. Alina continued. I thought if I couldn't hold the violin the way I used to, then maybe I wasn't a violinist anymore. Suga stood beside her, listening with his hands loosely folded in front of him. His expression was almost unreadable, but Jimin knew him well enough to see the tension around his eyes. Alina looked toward the audience. Then I watched an interview with Jimin. Jimin's eyebrows lifted slightly. He said something about asking someone to stay beside you. She gave a nervous smile. I don't remember the exact words anymore, but I remembered how he said it. Jimin lowered his eyes, and somehow that was enough to make me write the letter. Jimmy looked at Jimin, then at Suga. The letter you received, Jimin nodded. Yes. Alina's fingers tightened around the violin case. I wrote that I didn't need anyone to fix my life. She looked directly at Jimin. I meant it. Jimin nodded. I know, but I was lying a little. Her voice became quieter. Not about the fixing part. I don't need someone to fix me. I just didn't want to be alone while I figured out what was left. Suga looked at her then. Something in his expression softened. Jimmy slowly stepped away from his desk. Can I ask you something? Alina nodded. Why bring the violin? Alina looked down at the case. Because my mother told me I shouldn't leave it at home. Why? She said maybe I wouldn't play tonight. Alina smiled faintly, but she thought I should at least remember that it still belonged to me. The audience released a collective breath. Jimin glanced toward Suga. Suga's eyes had become wet, though he blinked it away almost immediately. The band remained silent. The studio cameras had pulled back now, allowing the audience to see all three figures together without turning Alina into a close-up. Then something unexpected happened. From the front row, a little girl stood up. She was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing a purple sweatshirt several sizes too large for her. Her mother gently tried to pull her back into her seat, but the girl whispered something toward the stage. Alina didn't hear it. Jimin did. She said, "I stopped playing too." Alina turned. The girl was holding a small recorder flute in her lap. Her mother looked embarrassed, but Jimmy immediately smiled. "It's okay," he said. "You can stay standing." The girl looked at Alina. "My teacher said I wasn't good enough." Alina's face changed. She crouched slightly, still holding the violin case. "Did you like playing?" The girl nodded. "Then maybe your teacher was wrong about something." The girl's eyes widened. "What?" Alina smiled through tears. "Maybe being good isn't the reason you should play." The girl looked down at her instrument. Jimin watched the exchange with a quiet expression. Suga looked toward the audience. One frightened young musician had somehow created a room full of people willing to admit the things they had hidden. A man in the second row wiped his eyes. An older woman pressed her hand against her mouth. One of the stage crew members turned away from the camera and pretended to adjust his headset. It was no longer a television segment. It had become a room where people were unexpectedly telling the truth without saying much at all. Then Alina's hand began trembling again. She tried to hide it behind the violin case. Jimin noticed. "You don't have to play," he whispered. Alina looked at him. "I know." "Do you want to?" She looked toward the stage, then toward the audience, then down at the case. "Maybe." Suga stepped forward. "Then we make it easy." He walked toward the musicians. "Can we borrow one microphone?" The bandleader nodded. "And no spotlight," Suga added. "Just enough light for her to see." The stage lighting changed. The harsh white beams softened into warm amber. The audience became almost completely silent. Alina slowly opened the case. The old violin appeared beneath the studio lights. Its wood was worn and scratched. The chin rest was visibly repaired. It looked like an instrument that had survived years of being carried through difficult places. Alina touched the strings with the tips of her fingers. Her hand trembled. She closed her eyes. "I don't know if I can." Jimin stood beside her. "Then stop whenever you want," Suga added quietly, "and if you make a mistake, we'll still be here." Alina gave a small laugh. "That's not very reassuring." Suga's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "It wasn't supposed to be." The audience laughed softly. The tension broke for a moment. Alina placed the violin beneath her chin. She raised the bow. The first note came out thin and uncertain. She stopped, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry." Jimin immediately shook his head. "Don't apologize," she looked at him. "But it sounded bad." "So," Suga said. "Came here to play, not to audition." Alina looked at him for a long second. Then she raised the bow again. The second note was steadier, then the third. Slowly the room changed. The sound was not flawless. There were small imperfections, slight hesitations, moments where her hands struggled to obey what her mind remembered. But there was something deeply human in it. She wasn't trying to prove that the diagnosis had not changed her. She was allowing herself to discover who she might become after it had. Jimin watched without blinking. Suga looked down at the floor, listening. Jimmy stood completely still. The song ended after less than a minute. No grand orchestral finish. No dramatic flourish. Just one final trembling note that faded into silence. For 2 seconds nobody moved. Then the audience stood. The applause rose slowly, almost cautiously, before becoming enormous. Alina covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Jimin placed a hand lightly against his own chest. Suga looked toward the audience, then toward Alina. She was crying, but she was smiling. And then a man from the production crew entered the stage holding a small envelope. He approached Jimin and whispered something. Jimin's expression immediately changed. "What?" Suga asked. Jimin read the message again. "It's from Alina's mother." Alina looked startled. "My mother?" Jimin nodded. "She sent it through the staff." He handed Alina the envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a photograph. Alina looked at it and froze. It was an old picture of her sitting beside her mother in the kitchen, violin in her lap, both of them laughing. On the back, her mother had written only one sentence: "I never needed you to become famous. I only wanted you to keep becoming yourself." Alina broke down. She bent forward, covering her face with both hands. Jimin moved toward her instinctively but stopped before touching her. He waited. Alina eventually reached for him herself. He embraced her gently. The audience applauded again, but Suga remained still, watching. There was something about the moment that seemed to trouble him, not because it was sad, because he knew what would happen next. The cameras would want a perfect ending. The producers would want another emotional beat. The internet would want a clip, and Alina would become a headline before she had even left the building. Suga walked toward Jimmy. "Can I say something?" Jimmy nodded. Suga turned toward the audience. "Night, everyone is going to remember the violin." He paused, "but I hope they remember something else." The room quieted. She was brave before she played one note. Alina looked at him. Suga continued. "She was brave when she wrote that letter. She was brave when she came here. She was brave when she said no. And she was brave when she changed her mind." Jimin looked at Suga with a small smile. Then Suga turned toward him. "Actually," he said quietly, "there's someone else who needs to hear something." Jimin's expression changed. "Me?" Suga nodded. "You." The audience laughed softly, assuming another playful exchange was coming, but Suga did not smile. "You've spent years thinking you have to make everyone feel okay." Jimin stared at him. "Suga, I'm serious." His voice remained calm. "You don't always have to carry everybody." Jimin's eyes lowered. "I know." "No," Suga said. "You say you know." A pause. "That's different." The studio became silent again. The words were not part of the planned show. They were not part of the interview. They were not meant to be performed. Jimin looked at Suga for several seconds. Then he laughed nervously. "Why are you saying this here?" Suga answered. "Because you never listened backstage." The audience laughed again, but Jimin's eyes had become glassy. Suga stepped closer. "You've been worrying about everyone since we walked in." Jimin swallowed. "Because someone has to." "No," Suga shook his head. "Sometimes someone just has to stand beside you." Jimin stared at him. For a moment, the entire studio seemed to disappear. No cameras, no audience, no producer, just two friends standing beneath warm lights after watching another person find the courage to begin again. Then Suga did something that nobody expected. He reached toward Jimin, pulled him into a brief embrace, and when they separated, Suga leaned forward and kissed Jimin quickly on the forehead. The audience gasped. Jimin froze, eyes widening. Jimmy's mouth fell open in surprise. The band stopped moving. Even the crew seemed to forget their next cue. Suga looked at Jimin as though nothing extraordinary had happened. "You needed that," he said quietly. Jimin stared at him, then laughed through tears. But Suga suddenly leaned closer again, and this time, in the confusion of the moment, their faces came close enough that the studio erupted in startled screams. For a heartbeat, it looked as though Suga might kiss Jimin on the lips. Instead, he stopped just short, turned his head, and whispered something only Jimin could hear. Jimin's expression changed immediately. His surprise became understanding. "You idiot," he whispered, smiling through tears. The cameras captured only fragments. The audience saw the movement. The internet would later replay it endlessly. Headlines would call it a shocking kiss. Some would call it fan service. Others would invent explanations that neither man had ever given. But Alina, standing just a few feet away, understood what the cameras did not. Suga had not been trying to create a scandal. He had been trying to remind Jimin of the same lesson they had just given her. Sometimes the person who spends all their time standing beside everyone else needs someone willing to stand beside them. Alina wiped her tears and smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. Suga looked at her. "For what?" "For making him stop." Suga glanced at Jimin. "I didn't make him stop." Jimin laughed. "She means me." Alina nodded. "You." Jimin looked down, embarrassed. "Maybe I needed it." And in that moment, the meaning of the evening shifted. The unexpected gesture between Jimin and Suga was no longer the center of the story. It was a mirror, a reminder that affection between friends could be quiet, awkward, protective, and impossible to explain to strangers who only saw a few seconds through a camera lens. But there was still one thing Jimin had not noticed. As Alina closed her violin case, she quietly slipped the photograph from her mother into her coat pocket. On the back of the photograph was another line, one she had not read yet. and when she finally turned it over, the words made her stop breathing. Her mother had written, "There is one more person you need to forgive before you can play again." Alina looked toward the backstage corridor. Her face changed. Jimin noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" Alina folded the photograph. "Nothing." But this time, Jimin knew she was lying, and somewhere beyond the studio doors, someone who had been avoiding Alina for months was waiting in the rain. The applause had finally begun to fade when Alina stepped away from the stage, still holding the photograph against her chest. The warm studio lights remained behind her, but the hallway beyond the curtain was dim and almost empty. It smelled faintly of coffee, rain-soaked coats, and the hot metal of stage equipment. Jimin followed a few steps behind. Suga came after him. Neither asked about the message immediately. They could see that Alina was trying to understand something herself. She walked until she reached a small waiting area beside a service elevator, then stopped. Her reflection appeared in the dark glass of the elevator doors. She looked at herself for a long time. "Who is it?" Jimin finally asked. Alina's shoulders tightened. "My father." The word seemed to cost her something. Suga leaned against the wall but said nothing. Alina opened the photograph again. On the front was the old image of herself and her mother. She turned it over and read the sentence underneath. "There is one more person you need to forgive before you can play again." Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought I had." Jimin stood beside her. "What happened?" Alina shook her head. "He left when I was 12. She paused. "Not dramatically, that's the part people don't understand. He didn't disappear in one night. He just kept leaving a little more every day." Her fingers folded the photograph until the edges bent. First he stopped coming home for dinner. Then he stopped asking about school. Then he stopped asking about Mateo. Eventually he moved out. Jimin listened without interrupting. Alina continued, "My mother told me not to hate him. She said people can be weak without being evil. I tried to believe that." Suga looked at her. "Did you?" Alina gave a sad smile. "Sometimes." A door opened at the end of the hallway. A man in a dark coat stepped inside. He was perhaps in his 50s, carrying an old black umbrella. He stopped when he saw Alina. His face changed immediately. Alina stopped breathing. Jimin looked towards Suga. Suga gave him a barely perceptible nod. This was not their conversation to control. The man took one cautious step forward. "Alina," she didn't answer. "I didn't know if you'd come." Alina's eyes hardened. "You didn't know if I'd come because you didn't ask." The man lowered his gaze. "You're right." Silence filled the corridor. His name was Daniel. He had not seen his daughter in nearly 3 years. He had learned about her illness through Alina's mother but had been too ashamed to call. He had sent money twice, both times without a message, and when neither payment received a response, he convinced himself that staying away was an act of respect. It wasn't. It was fear disguised as restraint. "Why are you here?" Alina asked. Daniel looked toward the stage. "Your mother called me." Alina's expression changed. "She told me you were coming." "No," he swallowed. "She told me I should stop waiting for you to forgive me." Alina looked away. "I don't know if I can." Daniel nodded. "You don't have to." That answer surprised her. He continued, "I came because I realized I kept asking you to make my guilt easier." His voice shook. "I wanted you to say it was okay so I could stop feeling like the worst father in the world." He took another breath. "But it wasn't okay." Alina's eyes filled again. "No, I know. You missed everything." "I know." Mateo's hospital visits, my first orchestra recital, Mom working until midnight. Her voice rose. "You missed the day I got accepted into the conservatory." Daniel closed his eyes. "I know." Alina stepped closer. "Then why didn't you come back?" Daniel looked at his daughter. "Because every year I stayed away, coming back became harder." She stared at him. "That's your reason." "No," he shook his head. "It's my shame." He looked down. "And shame can make a coward feel like he's being noble." The sentence left Alina silent. Jimin watched from a distance. Suga remained beside him. Neither intervened. Alina's father reached into his coat and pulled out something small. It was an old violin bow. Alina immediately recognized it. "You kept that?" Daniel nodded. "Your mother gave it to me when you were 13. Alina touched it carefully. "I thought you threw it away." "I almost did." He smiled sadly. "But I couldn't." Alina looked at the bow, then at her father. "Why bring it now?" Daniel's eyes reddened. "Because I thought maybe you should have it back." She took it. Her fingers trembled, but this time she didn't hide them. Daniel stood there uncertainly. "I don't expect you to forgive me tonight." Alina looked at him. Good. A faint smile crossed his face. Good. For the first time, the tension in the hallway loosened. Alina turned toward Jimin. You knew? Jimin shook his head. No. Then why did you follow me? Because you looked like you needed someone nearby. Alina smiled. You really do that all the time, don't you? Jimin laughed softly. Apparently, Suga finally spoke. That's why we were talking about him earlier. Alina looked at Suga. You were? Yes. Jimin groaned. Please don't tell her. Too late. Alina laughed through her tears. What did you say? Suga looked at Jimin. That he thinks everyone else's problems are his responsibility. Jimin folded his arms. And you think that's not true? I think it's exhausting. Jimin looked away. Daniel quietly watched the two men. You two have known each other a long time. Long enough, Suga answered. Daniel nodded. You trust each other. Jimin looked at Suga. Most days. Suga gave him a sideways glance. That's generous. They laughed. Alina watched them. The laughter was small, but it changed the atmosphere. For the first time that night, she was not looking at Jimin and Suga as famous artists. She was looking at two friends who had learned through years of pressure and uncertainty that sometimes caring for someone meant refusing to let them pretend they were fine. Alina sat down on a nearby bench. Her father sat at the opposite end. Jimin remained standing. Suga looked toward the elevator. We should give them a minute. Jimin nodded, but before they left, Alina called out. Jimin, he turned. Thank you. For what? She looked at the photograph. For reading my letter. Jimin smiled. I'm glad you wrote it. I almost didn't. I know. How did you know? Jimin's expression became thoughtful. Because people who are used to being strong usually delete the message before they send it. Alina looked down. That's exactly what I did. Jimin smiled. Then I'm glad you changed your mind. They walked away together. The moment they turned the corner, Jimin exhaled. That was heavy. Suga nodded. Yeah. They continued down the hallway. Did you mean what you said on stage? Jimin asked. Which part? About me? Suga didn't answer immediately. Yes. You really think I carry too much? I know you do. Jimin smiled faintly. And what about you? Suga stopped walking. What about me? You think you don't? Suga looked at him. I never said that. Jimin laughed. So you're allowed to tell me to rest, but you don't have to. Correct. That's ridiculous. Probably. Jimin shook his head, then his expression became serious. Earlier, Suga waited. The kiss. What about it? You scared me. Suga's face softened. Sorry. I thought you were going to actually kiss me. Suga looked at him for a moment, then smiled. You looked terrified. I was. Good. Jimin stared at him. Why is that good? Because you finally stopped thinking about everyone else for 2 seconds. Jimin burst out laughing. You're impossible. Suga smiled. Maybe. They reached the dressing room. The other members were waiting. Jungkook immediately looked up. What happened? J-Hope grinned. We saw the audience reaction. Jin raised an eyebrow. I think half the internet is going to lose its mind. V laughed quietly. RM shook his head. Forget the internet. Is Alina okay? Jimin nodded. Her father came. The room became quiet. Her father? RM asked. Yeah, Jimin explained what had happened. Nobody interrupted. When he finished, Jin leaned back and said, sometimes people don't need an apology. They need to know they are finally allowed to be angry. J-Hope nodded. And sometimes forgiveness takes longer than the person who hurt you wants. Jungkook looked toward Suga. What about you? Suga frowned. What about me? You kissed Jimin on television. The room exploded with laughter. Jimin covered his face. Please don't start. Suga sat down calmly. It wasn't like that. Jin smiled. We didn't say what it was. You were thinking it. Everyone was thinking it. Jimin looked at Suga. This is your fault. Suga shrugged. Worth it. For a moment the room returned to normal, teasing, laughter, familiar voices, but beneath it was something deeper. Each member had understood why Suga had done it. It wasn't about creating a moment. It was about breaking Jimin's habit of hiding his own emotions behind concern for everyone else. The gesture had been impulsive, perhaps poorly timed, and certainly impossible to explain to people who would later see only a few seconds of footage. But inside that room, nobody needed an explanation. They knew each other too well. Later that night, after the show ended, Jimin found Alina sitting alone near the studio exit. Her father had already left. She was holding the old violin bow in one hand and her mother's photograph in the other. Did you talk? Jimin asked. Alina nodded. For 40 minutes. That's a long conversation. It wasn't enough. Jimin smiled. Maybe it doesn't have to be. Alina looked at him. He asked if he could come to my next appointment. Jimin waited. Did you say yes? Alina looked down. I said he could ask again tomorrow. Jimin nodded approvingly. That's a good answer. Alina smiled. You really think so? I do. She looked toward the empty street outside. Rain continued to fall beneath the streetlights. I'm still angry. You can be. And I still miss him. You can do both. Alina looked at him. How do you know? Jimin thought for a moment. Because people aren't simple, she smiled. Neither are you, he laughed. Definitely not. A few steps away, Suga stood near the entrance waiting. Alina noticed him. He really does watch over you. Jimin turned. Unfortunately, Suga raised an eyebrow. I can hear you, Alina laughed. Then she looked at both of them. Can I ask one thing? Sure, Jimin said. Why did you two come with me? Jimin glanced at Suga. Suga glanced back. Neither answered immediately. Finally, Suga said, because you asked us to stay. Alina frowned. I didn't. Suga smiled faintly. You didn't have to. They walked out into the rain together. Behind them, the studio lights shut down one by one. The cameras were packed away. The audience had gone home. The stage that had witnessed the unexpected gesture was empty. But somewhere online, the first clips of the night were already spreading. People were replaying the moment Suga moved toward Jimin. They were freezing frames, guessing intentions, arguing over what it meant. Almost none of them knew about Alina. Almost none knew about the letter, the violin, the father waiting in the rain, or the quiet conversation in the hallway. And perhaps that was the strangest part of the night. The moment that would become famous was not the moment that changed anyone's life. The real turning point had happened away from the cameras, when three people who had arrived carrying completely different kinds of loneliness discovered that being understood did not always require an explanation. Sometimes it began with something much smaller. A bottle of water left outside a door, a friend standing between you and a camera, a father finally admitting that his absence had been a choice, or a hand reaching for another hand without demanding anything in return. And as the three of them disappeared into the rainy New York night, Alina carried her violin case differently than she had when she arrived. It was still heavy. Her future was still uncertain. Her hand still trembled. Her father had not magically repaired the years he had missed. Jimin had not suddenly learned how to stop worrying about everyone. Suga had not stopped carrying his own private burdens. Nothing had been solved, but something had changed. For the first time in months, Alina was no longer asking whether her old life could return. She was beginning to wonder what kind of new life she could build with the pieces that remained. The rain had become heavier by the time they reached the waiting cars outside the studio, turning the pavement into a mirror of red taillights and white street lamps. Security personnel opened umbrellas, managers spoke quietly into phones, and a few journalists waited beyond the barriers hopping to capture a final image of BTS leaving the building. Jimin paused beneath the awning and looked back through the glass doors. Alina was still inside. Her father had not returned. Her violin case rested against the wall beside her. For a moment she looked impossibly small in the enormous lobby. Should we wait? Jimin asked. Suga nodded. Of course. Their manager glanced at the clock. We need to leave soon. Jimin looked at him. 5 more minutes. The manager hesitated, then nodded. 5. Jimin walked back inside. Suga followed. Alina looked up when she heard their footsteps. You're still here, Jimin smiled. We said we'd stay. She looked toward the doors. I thought you had to go. We do. Suga sat beside her, but not yet. Alina smiled faintly. Then her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and froze. It was a message from Mateo. Her younger brother had been watching the show from the hospital television. The message contained only 4 words, "You played again." Alina stared at it, then another message appeared. "Mom is crying." Alina laughed through tears. He always makes everything sound simple. Jimin smiled. Sometimes that's useful. Alina showed them the message. Suga read it and nodded. Call them. Alina hesitated. I don't want to cry. Jimin raised an eyebrow. You already are, she laughed. That's not helping. I know. Alina pressed the call button. Her mother's face appeared on the screen almost immediately. Behind her was a hospital room dimly lit except for the blue glow of the television. Mateo was sitting beside her holding his phone. The moment he saw Alina, he grinned. You played. Alina nodded. A little. Good. I made mistakes, Mateo shrugged. So, Alina laughed. Her mother looked at Jimin and Suga on the other side of the frame. Her expression became emotional. "Thank you," she whispered. Jimin shook his head. "Please don't thank us." Alina's mother smiled. "Then let me say something else." She looked directly at her daughter. "I'm proud of you." Alina's face crumpled. She covered her mouth and turned away from the camera. Mateo looked confused. "Why are you crying?" Alina laughed through her tears. "Because you're annoying." "I'm not." "You are," her mother laughed. For a few minutes the lobby of the television studio became strangely intimate. No cameras, no audience, no stage, just a mother in a hospital room, a younger brother watching from a chair, a daughter standing beside a violin case, and two friends who happened to remain when everyone else had left. Then Alina's mother said something that changed the atmosphere. "Your father came." Alina nodded. Her mother took a breath. "Did you talk?" "Yes." "Did you forgive him?" Alina looked down. "Not yet." Her mother smiled. "Good." Alina looked up, surprised. "Good. Forgiveness isn't a deadline." Her mother glanced toward Mateo. "Neither is healing." Alina wiped her eyes. "I thought you'd want me to. I want you to be honest." Her mother paused. "If you forgive him one day, do it because you are free to. If you don't punish yourself for that either." Alina stared at her mother. Those words settled into the room with the weight of something she would remember for years. Then Mateo suddenly said, "Wait." He pointed at the television behind them. "They're showing the clip." Alina turned. On the screen was a replay from the show. It showed Suga approaching Jimin, the audience gasping, Jimin freezing in surprise. The clip ended before anyone could understand what had happened afterward. A news presenter's voice said something about a surprising moment between the BTS members. Alina watched silently. Jimin's expression tightened. Suga looked at the screen without reacting. The presenter continued talking, but Alina's mother looked toward her daughter. "Is that what everyone is talking about?" Alina nodded. "Probably." Her mother smiled gently. "Then I hope they don't forget the violin." Alina laughed. "I hope so too." But the internet had already begun doing what the internet does. Short clips spread rapidly. Comment sections filled with speculation. Some people were amused. Some were confused. Some argued passionately about what they thought the gesture meant. Others criticized the production for bringing an emotional guest onto a late-night show. A few accounts, having no knowledge of Alina's private circumstances, reduced her entire appearance to a convenient, inspirational story. Within minutes, the human complexity of the evening began disappearing beneath headlines. Jimin's phone vibrated repeatedly. He turned it face down. Suga did the same. Alina noticed. "Are you worried?" she asked. Jimin smiled without much humor. "Not about me." "Then about what?" "About people deciding what happened before they know why." Alina looked at him. "You can't control that, I know." "Then why worry?" Jimin looked toward the rain outside. "Because sometimes people get hurt by stories that aren't theirs." Suga glanced at him. "And sometimes you worry about things that haven't happened yet." Jimin looked at him. "That's true." Alina smiled. "You two really do argue like an old married couple." Jimin immediately laughed. Suga shook his head. "Don't encourage him." For the first time that night, Alina laughed without forcing it. Then the lobby doors opened. Daniel walked inside again. Alina's smile disappeared. He was carrying something. He approached slowly and stopped several feet away. "I forgot to give you this." He held out a small envelope. Alina stared at it. "What is it?" "Something I wrote years ago." "Why didn't you send it?" Daniel looked down. "Because I was afraid you'd hate me." Alina's expression hardened. "You already gave me a reason." Daniel nodded. "I know." He placed the envelope on the bench instead of handing it directly to her. "You don't have to read it." Alina stared at the envelope. Her mother was still on the phone. She whispered, "Mom." Her mother nodded. "Read it when you're ready." Alina picked it up. Her fingers shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter dated 9 years earlier. The handwriting was rough and uneven. It began with an apology, not an excuse, not an explanation, an apology. Daniel had written about the day Alina's violin teacher told him that his daughter had extraordinary potential. He had written about how proud he felt. Then he had written about the night he left. He admitted that he had been drowning in debt, anger, and a sense of failure that he did not know how to name. He had convinced himself that leaving would protect them from his mistakes. "I told myself I was giving you a better life," the letter said. "Truth is that I was running away from the life I had already damaged." Alina stopped reading. She could not continue. She looked at Daniel. Why now? He swallowed. Because tonight I saw you play. You didn't see me play. I did. He gave a small smile. I was watching from the back of the studio. Alina stared at him. You were there, he nodded. I didn't want you to know. Why? Because I didn't want you to perform for me. Alina looked down. Did I? No. Daniel's voice broke slightly. You played for yourself. Silence. Alina sat down. She placed the letter beside her. I hate that I still want you to be proud of me. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I am. I know. She looked at him. That's what makes it worse. Daniel nodded. I understand. No, you don't. Her voice trembled. You don't know what it feels like to spend years wondering whether you were worth staying for. Daniel closed his eyes. You're right. Alina cried quietly. I kept thinking if I became better, you'd come back. Daniel's face collapsed with regret. Alina, I practiced because I thought if I played beautifully enough, maybe you'd hear about me. She wiped her cheeks. Then when my hands started shaking, I thought maybe now there's nothing left that could make you come back. Daniel looked at her. There was never anything wrong with you. Alina shook her head. I know that now, she paused, but I needed to hear it from you years ago. Daniel nodded. I should have been there. Yes, I wasn't. No, I'm sorry. Alina closed her eyes. For several seconds nothing happened. Then she reached across the bench and touched the old violin bow he had brought her. I don't forgive you yet. Daniel nodded. Okay. But maybe, she stopped. Maybe you can start showing up. Daniel's eyes filled again. I can do that. Alina looked at him. Don't promise. I won't. Just show up. I will. That was it. No embrace. No perfect reconciliation. No cinematic miracle. Just an agreement to attempt something difficult. Jimin watched quietly. Suga stood beside him. Alina's mother was still crying on the phone. Mateo was smiling. The hospital room, the television studio, the rain outside, and the years between father and daughter seemed to exist in the same moment. Then Alina stood and picked up her violin case. I want to play again tomorrow. Jimin smiled. Then tomorrow is enough. Suga nodded. One day at a time. Alina looked at both of them. Will you come hear me? Jimin hesitated. If you want us there. I do, Suga smiled faintly. Then we'll see. Their manager looked at his watch. We really have to go, Jimin laughed. Okay. Alina hugged him first. Then she hesitated before looking at Suga. He opened his arms slightly. She stepped into the embrace. Thank you, she whispered. Suga answered quietly. Don't thank us. Keep playing when you want to. Rest when you need to. That's enough. Alina pulled back. But if I can't play tomorrow? Then don't, she smiled. You're both terrible at inspirational speeches. Jimin laughed. We've been told. They walked toward the doors. Just before leaving, Jimin turned around. Alina, she looked up. Your mother was right. About what? The violin still belongs to you. Alina smiled. I know. Outside, the rain had softened. The car doors opened. Jimin climbed inside, then looked back at Suga. Are you okay? Suga nodded. Yeah. You sure? No. Jimin smiled. Good. Suga laughed. Why is that good? Because now you understand what you were doing to me earlier. Suga looked at him. What? You kept telling me I didn't have to be okay. Suga smiled. Fair. They sat inside the car. The door closed. For a few moments neither spoke. The city moved past the windows in blurred reflections. Then Jimin said quietly, thank you. Suga looked at him. For what? For tonight. You would have done the same. Jimin smiled. Probably. Suga looked out the window. That's why I did it. Jimin laughed softly. You really are strange, I know. Behind them, Alina stood beneath the awning with her father. She opened the violin case one more time. Her mother was still on the phone. Mateo was still talking too loudly from the hospital room. Daniel stood several feet away, not touching her, not asking for forgiveness, simply remaining where he had promised to remain. Alina lifted the violin. She didn't play. Not yet. She simply looked at it. For months, the instrument had represented everything she thought she had lost. Now, for the first time, it represented something different, not the life she used to have, not the person she used to be, possibility. The next morning, Alina woke before sunrise. Her hand was still trembling. The diagnosis had not disappeared. Her father was still learning how to be present. Her mother was still exhausted. Mateo still had hospital appointments. Nothing had become magically easier. But Alina opened the violin case. She lifted the instrument, and for the first time she did not ask whether she was good enough to play. She simply placed the violin beneath her chin. Meanwhile, across the city, Jimin woke to hundreds of messages about the previous night's broadcast. Some were funny, some were affectionate, some were intrusive, some completely misunderstood the moment. He scrolled for a few seconds, then stopped. One message from Suga was waiting. It contained only one sentence: "Don't read everything." Jimin smiled. He typed back, "Too late." A second message arrived immediately. "Then stop." Jimin laughed quietly. Outside his window, New York was beginning another ordinary morning. Somewhere in the city, Alina was drawing her bow across the strings again. Somewhere else, her father was preparing to attend an appointment he had once been too afraid to attend. And inside a quiet apartment, Jimin was learning the same lesson he had unknowingly taught someone else the night before. Being there for people did not mean carrying them. Sometimes it simply meant refusing to leave when they were struggling to stand. The public would remember a different part of that night. They would remember the gasp, the camera angle, Suga's sudden movement toward Jimin, and the few seconds that looked like a scandal waiting to happen. They would debate what it meant. They would create theories. They would turn a private gesture into a public mystery. But those who had actually stood backstage that night knew the truth was much quieter. The most important thing that happened had nothing to do with a kiss. It happened when a young woman opened a violin case she had been afraid to touch. It happened when a father admitted that shame had made him absent. It happened when a mother told her daughter that forgiveness was not a deadline. It happened when two friends reminded each other that strength did not mean carrying everything alone. And perhaps that was why, months later, when people still talked about the strange moment between Jimin and Suga on television, Jimin would sometimes smile and say nothing, because the world had remembered the wrong 5 seconds. The people who needed to remember the right 5 minutes never forgot them. In the weeks that followed, the television moment became something none of them could completely control. The clip of Suga leaning toward Jimin spread across social media within hours, stripped of the conversation that had come before it and separated from the story of Alina entirely. Headlines appeared in different languages. Some treated it as a joke. Some treated it as a mystery. Others insisted they knew exactly what the gesture meant, despite having seen only a few seconds. Jimin discovered that there was a strange distance between what had happened and what people believed had happened. He tried not to read the comments, but occasionally a headline would appear on his phone, and he would stare at it for a moment before locking the screen again. Suga was even less interested. "Let them talk," he said one afternoon inside a quiet recording room. Jimin sat on the floor with his back against the wall, stretching his legs after rehearsal. "Easy for you to say." Suga looked up from his notebook. "Why?" "Because you caused it." Suga raised an eyebrow. "You were there. I was surprised." "That was the point," Jimin laughed. "You really don't regret it," Suga thought for a moment. "I regret that people are using it to ignore everything else." Jimin's expression softened. "Me too." They sat in silence. The recording room was almost dark except for the blue glow from the equipment rack. A faint hum came from the speakers. Outside, someone walked down the hallway carrying a box of cables. The world continued moving normally, despite the fact that millions of strangers were still discussing a few seconds of their lives. Then Jimin's phone vibrated. It was Alina. Her message was short. "I played for 12 minutes today." Jimin smiled. He showed Suga. 12 minutes, Suga said. "That's good." Another message appeared. "My hand shook 3 times." Suga looked at the screen. "And," Jimin typed back, "and you still played." Alina replied almost immediately. "Yes," Suga nodded. "Then that's what matters." Alina's progress was not dramatic. There were no overnight miracles. Some mornings she practiced for 20 minutes. Other days she couldn't play at all. Her hands still trembled without warning. Sometimes frustration made her close the violin case and walk away. But the difference was that she no longer interpreted every difficult day as proof that she had failed. She had begun keeping a small notebook beside her music stand. On the first page, she wrote 3 sentences. "Today I played, today I rested, both count." Her mother found the notebook one morning and cried quietly in the kitchen. Daniel began showing up, but he did it carefully. He did not demand closeness. He attended appointments when Alina invited him. He waited outside when she needed space. He brought groceries to her mother's apartment without expecting to be thanked. He started repairing small things around the house, not because fixing a broken cabinet could repair 9 years of absence, but because it was one tangible way of learning how to stay. One evening, Alina found him sitting on the floor beside the old violin case. "What are you doing?" she asked. Daniel looked embarrassed. "Trying to fix the latch." Alina crouched beside him. "You know it isn't broken." He looked at the latch. "Oh," she laughed. "You just wanted something to do." Daniel smiled. "Maybe." Alina sat beside him. For several minutes they worked in silence. It was not reconciliation. It was something quieter. Familiarity returning carefully, one ordinary moment at a time. Meanwhile, the other BTS members had their own way of responding to the aftermath. Jin turned the entire situation into a running joke whenever the mood became too serious. "Next time," he told Suga during rehearsal, "please warn us before creating international headlines." Suga looked at him. "Why?" "So I can prepare popcorn." J-Hope laughed so loudly that the dance staff turned around. Jungkook shook his head. "You guys are unbelievable," V smiled. "At least the audience remembers the violin now." RM nodded. "That's the important part." He had been following Alina's progress quietly through Jimin. One evening he sent her a short message through the appropriate staff channel. "Keep making music in whatever form feels right. It doesn't have to look like the old version." Alina saved the message. She never told him, but she read it whenever frustration returned. Jimin, however, found himself thinking about the night more often than he expected. Not because of the public attention, because Alina's story had exposed something in him that he had spent years avoiding. He realized how quickly he moved toward other people's pain. If someone was struggling, he wanted to help. If someone cried, he wanted to comfort them. If someone felt alone, he wanted to stay. Those instincts were sincere, but they could become exhausting when he forgot that other people had the right to struggle without being rescued. One evening after rehearsal, he sat alone in a practice room. The lights were off except for a narrow strip of illumination beneath the door. Suga entered carrying 2 bottles of water. "You disappeared." Jimin smiled. "I needed quiet." Suga sat beside him. "You okay?" Jimin looked at him. "I don't know." Suga handed him the water. "Good answer." Jimin laughed. "You always say that, because it's usually honest." Jimin opened the bottle. "Do you ever think about Alina?" "Sometimes. I keep wondering whether we're actually helping or just becoming another chapter in her story." Suga considered the question. "Probably both." Jimin frowned. "That's not comforting. It's realistic." He leaned back against the wall. "We met her at one point in her life. We can't decide what she becomes after that." Jimin nodded slowly. "You're right. That's why you have to let go." "I'm terrible at that." "I know." Jimin smiled. "You know too much." Suga looked toward the mirror. "Maybe." The room became quiet. Then Jimin asked, "Do you regret what you did on stage?" Suga shook his head. "No, even now, especially now." Jimin looked at him. "Why?" Suga's answer was simple. "Because you were forgetting yourself." Jimin lowered his eyes. "And you weren't?" Suga smiled. "I'm working on it." That sentence stayed with Jimin. It was not a perfect answer. It was better than one. Weeks later, Alina received an invitation to perform at a small community arts center in Queens. It was not a prestigious venue. There were no television cameras, no celebrity guests, no flashing lights. The stage was a wooden platform inside a converted school auditorium. The sound system occasionally crackled. One of the curtains was slightly crooked. 47 people attended. Alina nearly canceled twice. On the morning of the performance, her hand shook badly enough that she dropped her bow. She sat on the floor and stared at it. Daniel found her there. "You don't have to perform." Alina looked at him. "I know." "I'm serious." "I know." He waited. "Then why are you still sitting here?" Alina picked up the bow. "Because I want to decide not to perform for the right reason." Daniel smiled. "What's the right reason?" She thought about it. "Because I don't want to, not because I'm afraid someone will see me struggle." Daniel nodded. "That's a good reason." Alina stood. "And if I decide to play, I'll be in the front row." She looked at him. "You better be." "I will." The performance began at 7. Alina walked onto the stage wearing a simple black dress. Her mother sat in the front row beside Mateo. Daniel sat beside them. A small group of friends filled the remaining seats. There were no cameras, no producers, no headlines. Alina lifted the violin. Her hand trembled. She smiled. "It's going to shake," she said into the microphone. A few people laughed gently. "So if it does, just give me a second." Then she began. The first piece was imperfect. The second was better. By the third, Alina had stopped thinking about her hand. She was listening to the music again. After the performance, Mateo ran onto the stage and hugged her. Her mother cried. Daniel stood a few feet away, smiling without approaching until Alina opened her arms. Then he stepped forward. It was not a grand reconciliation. It was simply a father hugging his daughter while she still had tears on her face. At the back of the room, someone quietly recorded the final moments on a phone. The video was later posted online. It received a few hundred views, then a few thousand. Eventually, someone recognized Alina's name and connected her story to the television appearance. The clip began spreading again, but this time something was different. People did not focus on the controversial moment between Jimin and Suga. They focused on Alina's performance. Comments appeared from musicians who had experienced injuries, illness, anxiety, rejection, and long periods of silence. One wrote that they had stopped playing for 7 years and had finally opened their instrument case again. Another said they had been afraid to return to the stage after being told their hands would never be the same. A third simply wrote, "I played today too." Jimin saw the video late one night. He watched Alina finish the final piece. He didn't tell anyone at first. He simply smiled. Then he sent it to Suga. "She did it." Suga replied a few minutes later. "I knew she would." Jimin typed, "How?" The answer came quickly. "Because she stopped trying to become the person she was before." Jimin stared at the message. Then he looked out the window. He realized that this was the part of the story nobody had seen on television. The real transformation had not been Alina becoming stronger. It had been Alina becoming less afraid of being different from who she had been. Months passed. The public attention surrounding Jimin and Suga slowly faded, replaced by newer stories, newer headlines, newer controversies. The infamous clip was still available online, but it no longer dominated conversations. Jimin and Suga continued working. They rehearsed. They recorded. They traveled. They laughed with the other members. They argued over small things. They grew tired. They supported one another in the ordinary ways that rarely make headlines. Alina continued playing. Some weeks were difficult. Some were surprisingly good. She eventually began teaching beginner violin lessons at the same community center where she had first discovered music as a child. Her students were mostly children whose families could not afford private lessons. She did not promise them that talent would solve everything. She taught them something more useful, how to stay curious when they were frustrated. One afternoon, a little boy named Aaron threw his bow onto the floor. "I can't do it," he said. Alina crouched beside him. "You don't have to do it yet. But everyone else can. Then watch them." He looked confused. "Why?" "So you can see that everyone struggles with something you can't see." Aaron picked up the bow. Alina smiled. She realized she had once needed someone to tell her the same thing. In a different city, Jimin received a handwritten letter from Alina months after the television appearance. It contained no dramatic news. She simply wrote that she was teaching children now, that Mateo was doing better, that her mother had started laughing more, and that Daniel had attended 4 appointments without being asked. At the bottom she wrote, "I don't think you changed my life. I think you reminded me that it was still mine." Jimin read the sentence twice. He showed it to Suga. Suga nodded quietly. "That's a good letter." "Yeah." Jimin folded it carefully. "I'm keeping it." Suga looked at him. "Of course you are." Jimin smiled. "You know what? What? I think I finally understand what you meant." "About what?" "Standing beside someone without trying to carry them." Suga nodded. "Took you long enough." Jimin laughed. "Don't ruin the moment." Suga smiled. "Too late." And somewhere between those ordinary conversations, the memory of that night became less about a television scandal and more about a quiet chain of human choices. A young woman chose to open her violin case. A father chose to return without demanding forgiveness. A mother chose honesty over pressure. A group of friends chose to protect someone's dignity even when cameras were waiting. And 2 friends chose, in their own imperfect way, to remind each other that affection did not always need an explanation. The world had seen one unexpected gesture. The people involved had lived an entire evening. Those were 2 very different things.